Hello, Uta here. I'm in the guest bedroom. Oh, the work is almost done. We had the baseboard put in. Uh, so these are these wonderful dahlias. I have, I think, five of these plants. It's called Mystic Spirit. That's the variety. This is how it looks when it first opens. This is officially my third flower of my Mystic Spirits. And then later, it sort of mellows out into a more apricot color. And then when the dahlias are done, you get this fuzzy part from the middle and the petals drop off. And then it starts to get pointy. And when you need to deadhead them, uh, that's what you look for. The buds will be rounded and the finished flowers will be pointy. And it's important to deadhead, of course, with flowers because then you will get more flowers. Sometimes you have to do what's called the Chelsea chop, like Chelsea Flower Show, and just kind of cut off like the top half and then let it regrow and it will rebloom. Again, it's a pretty serious topic. I'm going to read Chris Rufo's writing. He is a middle to conservative commentator and journalist, and he is at what's it called? Contributing editor of City Journal, and I think that's connected to the Heritage Foundation. He's been revealing a lot of truths about craziness in the trans world, in the cross-sex ideology. Now, this is very important, which is why I'm reading it. I have it up on utahagengrasswidow.wordpress.com, my WordPress blog, and I'm going to read it now. It is a physician who is willing to speak out about the indoctrination and ideological capture of the field of medicine and how doctors are pressured and some are captured and some are, like Nettie, men who think that they are women who ideate a female persona, such as Dr. Mark, now called Marcy Bowers. And that individual was on those jazz shows and did, I guess, the original surgery that didn't work so well. And we were attending the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the same time. And then he married Anne and had three children. And then he decided that he's not going to be a husband anymore. And Anne is not divorced from him. Dr. M.M. Bowers has the gall to say we're like sisters. But they don't live together, and M.M. Bowers has publicly had affairs with much younger female medical residents. How about that? He talks about it, so that's known, you know. Okay, so this is a different physician, and I am just going to call him, I'm going to call him Dr. P for physician, okay? This is Chris Rufo's words. I have been engaged in an ongoing dialogue with a physician who works in a major children's hospital in a blue city. This physician has witnessed firsthand how transgender ideology has captured the medical profession and jeopardized the first commandment of the healing sciences: do no harm. He has now chosen to speak out on condition of anonymity because he is alarmed by the sudden corruption of the medical community. His colleagues, many of whom oppose transgender interventions, have so far chosen to stay silent. Well, we trans widows understand, because you are vilified and defamed when you speak the truth. However, we just saw Riley Gaines' testimony in Congress. That too, some of the links to that are at utahagengrasswidow.wordpress.com. And I think that's actually pretty important. We can't expect mainstream media to report on this, but the other people who were supporting the whole idea of child transition and the people who were promoting the suicide narrative were really looking like fools. That's the only way I can characterize it. So, anyway, I also trust Chris Rufo that this is a real person, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhere on the West Coast where Chris Rufo lives. Um, okay, yes, this interview has been edited for length and clarity. Rufo, please begin by setting the scene. What is it like in a major children's hospital in the United States regarding transgender interventions for children? Dr. P, I think the best way to answer that question is to talk about the cultural shift that happened in 2020. Because transgender ideology and COVID are inextricably linked. Normally, doctors operate by the authority of the professional societies that govern our specific practice. That worked because the individuals in those institutions were reliable, intelligent, and thoughtful. But with COVID in 2020, we started getting medical decrees without peer review or evidence. You saw this with masks, social distancing, and emergency use authorizations. These decrees were expressed as something everyone had to do without justification based on sound science. The other thing was censorship. If you were to ask questions or express doubt about these medical decrees, you would be ostracized within your department, and you stood a good chance of being publicly humiliated, severely reprimanded, or fired. That's when transgender ideology really took off. Now, I would say that 2015 also is when this ideology took off because of all the science magazines like Scientific American publishing something about the spectrum of sex. Um, and of course, my situation goes back 30 years. Within these academic institutions, so-called experts in the field of transgender medicine would simply declare that puberty blockers and other interventions were the gold standard of care. Now, we all know that that's based on 33 exit surveys from a study that went down to 53 because of 15 people leaving and 2 deaths. Those are called the Dutch studies, and the Dutch protocols, so-called, came out of the Dutch studies. So that is very, very poor quality. I wouldn't even call it science. That is pseudo research. So the evidence to support this is completely fraudulent, but no dissent was permitted. Everyone within the medical community knew that if he questioned transgender ideology, he would suffer the same type of repercussions that had happened during COVID. The best way to describe the environment would be as an authoritarian, censorious culture that discourages any meaningful debate and encourages the demonization of anyone who asks questions. Rufo asked, what are the main tenets of transgender medical theory that are enforced as the conventional wisdom, and how have those tenets changed medical practice? Dr. P. 1. When an individual believes he or she is of a certain sex, he or she is truly of that sex. 2. The ideal response is to affirm that individual's preferred identity. 3. The repercussion of non-intervention is a higher likelihood of that individual committing suicide. Now, we know from the Swedish study, Cecilia Dana, Dheine, 2011 in Sweden, that the suicide rate is higher than the control group, 40 times higher for females, and about 20 times higher death by suicide in males. Those were individuals who had the operations 1973 to 2003 and were deceased. So they were studying death records, and their control group was also Swedes who were age matched and economically matched, who had also died. That was the control group. Okay, so that's the Swedish study of the death records. So, okay, puberty blockers became justified at 11 years old. Hormones became justified at 13 years old. Double mastectomy becomes justified before 18. But in reality, when you affirm these individuals' gender identity, what you are doing is affirming their hatred for themselves. That speaks to the rage, which is just at the surface. I experience that. Trans widows experience that. You have these children who are going through confusing times, difficult times. When you affirm this belief system, what you are really doing is telling them you hate yourself at this moment, and I will affirm that. We have to ask ourselves, why do these people have such high rates of suicide? I actually don't believe that children prior to all the treatments are actually committing suicide. You know, I don't think the records show that. I think it's after that the suicides are occurring. Of course, we have no real data anywhere. Okay. We have to ask ourselves, why do these people have such high rates of suicide? Okay, so that's the narrative. Because we're affirming that they should hate themselves and they should try to destroy themselves. Chris Rufo asks, and yet these are medical doctors. They presumably understand basic human biology. They presumably agree with the dictum, first do no harm. And yet they've bought into this, not just abstractly, but concretely. They're performing these procedures. How does all their background knowledge crumble in the face of these ideas? Great question. Dr. P. I believe that it's because they've bought into a false ideology of transgenderism. And when people have a false ideology, they need a way to separate themselves from non-believers and to express their faith to other believers. And if these rituals are not derived from a cultural heritage with a moral tradition, such as religious, they become susceptible to unbound human depravity, e.g., Dairy Queens. When you look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have the outlawing of child sacrifice and other ways that standards were codified, but in the transgender ideology, none of these guardrails exist. So what becomes the greatest expression of faith to other believers? To sacrifice the most pure and innocent. Once they do that, they become heroes. They become martyrs. They have their flag hung up at the White House. And there's no going back, because if they were to demonstrate any degree of humility, they would have to come to terms with the fact that they advocated for and participated in a practice that destroyed the lives of innocent children. Rufo, tell me more about what's happening to these kids and their health outcomes. It brings me back to a story. There was a child in the children's hospital in his teens who had really bad Crohn's disease, which is an intestinal condition, to the point where he'd already had multiple surgeries. And that's serious because they're probably taking out pieces of intestine. That child would always be coming back to the hospital and the operating room. But one day at the same time, we were rolling that child into the OR. Another child was headed to the other operating room to get an implant put into his arm so that his hormones could be suppressed. So that's a child. If you're suppressing hormones, I believe that's what it is. The first child had no choice. He had no control over his condition of Crohn's. He was born that way. There was no way to prevent it from happening. But the second child was put into that situation because of the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the doctors, the politician, and those in the media who convinced him that this was the correct thing to do to cure his mental anguish. This should weigh heavily on the consciences of the doctors who did this to a child with the opportunity to live a normal life, to have a normal childhood. At some point, that child is going to wake up and he's going to realize that this was unnecessary, that his sexual organs are permanently mutilated, that the balance of his hormones is completely destroyed. He's going to realize there's no way back, that the people who were supposed to protect him threw him to the wolves. Rufo, what do you predict for the future of transgender medicine? Will it continue to gain ground or will it all fall apart? Dr. P, I don't know. I pray there is a change. One of the things I've been thinking about is what puberty blockers do to children. This medication is called a gonadotrophin releasing hormone agonist, and it comes in the form of monthly injections or an implant. And because it stimulates the activity of this hormone, it shuts down the activity of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is this almond-sized structure in your brain. It's one of the most primal structures we have, and it controls all the other hormonal structures in your body, your sexual development, your emotions, your fight or flight response, everything. But it shouldn't be described in such cold physiological terms because your hypothalamus is not just a hormone factory. It's this system that allows you to stand in awe of the beauty of a sunset or hear the sounds of orchestral music and to stop whatever you're doing and want to listen. And I always think that if someone were to ask me, where is it that you look for the divine spark in each individual? I would say that it would be somewhere beneath the inner chamber, which is the Greek derivation for the word hypothalamus. To shut down that system is to shut down what makes us human. So, yes, the hypothalamus is involved in our appreciation of the flowers and the insects. Please share, please like, subscribe, comment, positive comments, and tell me how you're doing. Look for the butterflies. I'm on Great Spangled Fritillary number 19. I've been seeing 2 and 3 at a time.